Good morning. We have general questions. Question number 1, John Lamont.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it supports the restoration of train services to the Reston and East Linton stations.
Minister Keith Brown.
The Scottish Government supports the restoration of train services to the Reston and East Linton stations. Invitation to tender for the next ScotRail franchise requires bidders to provide proposals to increase services between Edinburgh and Berwick-upon-Tweed and Newcastle, serving potential new stations at Reston and at East Linton.
John Lamont.
I thank the Minister for that response. We now have an additional study to show the improved business case that the Minister sought for Reston and East Linton. And we know that Transport Scotland, as the Minister has said, has stated that any companies bidding for the new ScotRail franchise will need to consider new stations at Reston and East Linton. However, we lack a categorical statement from the SNP Government that they will provide additional funding to support these projects going forward. So can the Scottish Government give its full support for this project, both in words and in money?
Minister.
I'm very surprised at the tone of the question from John Lamont. We've made this position very clear that we are supportive. We've helped with the study. We've said as well that we put into the tender the priced options, which I think shows our intent, possibly at a cost of £2 million a year to provide the services. And what we've said is there's also the Scottish Stations Investment Fund, which the relevant parties can bid into. That's the stage that we're at just now. The initiative has now got to be taken by those that want to have the stations. And of course, we've said that that will be on the basis of, amongst other things, the level of contribution from third parties. So there's not a lack of commitment from the Scottish Government in relation to this. We're now waiting for the relevant parties to come forward with their proposals, which they can do on the back of the study which has been done and which we've supported. And we're very keen to see what they're going to come up with.
Question 2, Jackie Baillie.
To ask the Scottish Government how much funding has been distributed by the Scottish Welfare Fund in its first 6 months of operation.
Minister Margaret Burgess.
The official statistics on the Scottish Welfare Fund that were published on the 11th of February show that local authorities paid out £9.2 million in awards from the fund in its first 6 months of operation from April to September 2013, helping over 35,000 households. The same publication contains information on informal monitoring of the fund, and this shows around £18.5 million was spent by the end of December 2013.
Jackie Baillie.
I'm sure the Minister would agree that expenditure of less than a third in the first 6 months of operation is hardly desirable, and even the 9-month figures, informal though they may be, indicate that there is a substantial underspend with only 3 months to go. Does the Minister share my concern that the money that is so desperately needed for some of the poorest people in our communities isn't making it out the door into their pockets? And would she agree that an evaluation of the efficacy of the fund might be a useful thing for the Government to consider?
Minister.
Well, as the member is aware, this is a new fund from April, and we're projecting to spend most of the fund by March. The projected spend is that the fund will be spent. There will be some underspend in the fund, and we recognise that. And we've been working hard with local authorities to ensure that the money is getting out there. We looked at the guidance in October to make it more accessible, to be clearer in our guidance. We've done a lot of publicity work, we've done radio adverts, we've done a new round of leaflets and publication, we're talking to the third sector, we're doing all of that to ensure that the fund is getting to the people that need it most, and that's very clearly, I share the member's view in that. That's what we're doing, and we'll continue to monitor the fund to ensure the money gets out there.
Fiona MacLeod.
Can I make the Minister aware that in Eastern Bartonshire, the Lib Dem Conservative administration are on course for a large underspend in their Scottish Welfare Fund budget allocation, and I hear that that is apparently because grants are being refused unless people turn up with receipts for everything down to their messages, and perhaps that's an explanation of why Labour councils are refusing to help local people in need.
Minister.
Well, while the spend on the Scottish Welfare Fund is increasing overall, as I indicated, I am aware that the level of spend does vary from local authority to local authority. The Scottish Welfare Fund is administered by local authorities based on guidance from Scottish ministers, and we're working very closely with COSLA, local authorities and others to ensure the awareness of the scheme and also consistency. But on the member's point about gathering, having to show receipts for shopping, that's clearly not in the guidance from the Scottish Government. I mean, the guidance does suggest that local authorities need to gather sufficient information, but I would certainly say that asking for grocery receipts is not required, and certainly that's something we can bring up at the next practitioners' meeting.
Question 3, Stuart Maxwell.
To ask the Scottish Government what support it provides to people who are deaf or hard of hearing.
Cabinet Secretary Alex Neil.
Presiding Officer, last summer we consulted widely on a new sensory impairment strategy which we will be publishing shortly. The strategy, which will apply to people with a hearing impairment, visual impairment or dual sensory impairment, aims to deliver the seamless provision of assessment, care and support to people with a sensory impairment and the same access to education, employment, healthcare, social care and leisure as everyone else. Funding is being made available to local partnerships to support implementation of the strategy, and close partnership working between statutory and third sector agencies will be crucial to its success.
Stuart Maxwell.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer? The Cabinet Secretary is probably aware that under the Disability Reduction Scheme, people with disabilities are rightly able to apply for a council tax reduction so that they don't have to pay more council tax as a result of adaptations to their home. My constituent has alerted me to a lack of consistency amongst local authorities over whether deaf people are eligible for a reduction in council tax under this scheme. Can the Cabinet Secretary clarify whether deaf people are able to apply for a council tax reduction and under which circumstances they should do so?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, statutory responsibility for the implementation and administration of council tax, including eligibility for reductions or exemptions, lies with the relevant local authority. Ministers have no power to intervene in individual cases or comment on potential entitlement in relation to specific circumstances, although obviously I would wish, as a Cabinet Secretary with responsibility for health and social care, that local authorities would be empathetic and sympathetic to any such applications.
Question number 4, Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how pumped storage will add to Scotland's clean energy sustainability.
Minister Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, pumped storage plays an important role in Scotland's energy mix through its ability to respond quickly to cope with periods of peak demand. As the quantity of renewable generation increases, pumped storage allows for this energy to be stored at times of oversupply and released during periods of high demand. Increasing pumped storage capacity will strengthen Scotland's balanced energy mix, and in doing so, it can enhance security of supply across Britain.
Rob Gibson.
I thank the Minister for his answer. Since Scotland's potential for hydro and especially pumped storage has a low priority from Westminster Energy Support, how will the Scottish Government optimise its development to balance the supply of clean power from diverse renewable sources?
Minister.
Well, pumped storage and hydro are very important to Scotland. We have 2 pumped storage sites at Cruachan and at Foyers, both developed in 1967, a good year in many ways. And we very much hope that the UK Government will support hydro and pumped storage as well. They say that pumped storage may be eligible for their capacity incentivisation system, details of which have not yet been announced, but the detail will be vital, and we have urged Westminster that pumped storage must be prioritised as we move forward.
Question number 5, Richard Baker.
Ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had regarding the timescale for fatal accident inquiries concerning helicopter accidents.
Cabinet Secretary Ken McCaskill.
The Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service independently investigate all sudden, suspicious, accidental and unexplained deaths, and it would not be appropriate for the Scottish Government to seek to influence that investigation. Following full and thorough investigation into the circumstances, the Crown will determine whether to take criminal proceedings before any decision can be taken on whether to hold a fatal accident inquiry. Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service has set up a specialised team of prosecutors to investigate the incident at Sunborough and the incident at the Clutha Bar. As those investigations remain live, it would not be appropriate to comment further at this time. The team is in regular contact with the Air Accidents Investigation Branch. Those injured in these incidents and the relatives of those who were tragically killed will be kept fully informed of any developments. The matter of timescales for the holdings of FAIs will be considered further when the Government brings forward legislation to implement Lord Cullen's review of the FAI legislation, which we have committed to do within the lifetime of this Parliament.
Richard Baker.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his full answer, but will he accept that even including the time required for investigations by the Air Accidents Investigation Board and the Civil Aviation Authority, it shouldn't take 5 years for a fatal accident inquiry to be held into a helicopter accident, and that such a delay shouldn't be faced by the families who lost loved ones last year? Given that the Lord Advocate has given a welcome indication that he doesn't wish to see families face such a prolonged wait, what action will ministers take to ensure that this is the case, bearing in mind my colleague Patricia Ferguson has brought forward a Members' Bill proposal to address this very issue?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think everybody wants to deal with these matters as expeditiously as possible. The Lord Advocate, the Scottish Government and indeed everybody. There are specific reasons why there are sometimes going to always be delays, and clearly they should be limited. There has to be the hierarchy. The primary investigation here has to come from the AIB. They are the ones who initially have to investigate these matters, thereafter required to be considered by the Crown, as I indicated in my first answer. First of all, to consider whether or not there should be any criminal prosecution, and only thereafter whether there required to be, as I say, as an investigation and an FAI. With regard to the specific matter in terms of what was ongoing in Aberdeen relating to Sulphur Puma, there were further delays and difficulties caused by the clear desire to make sure that we had an appropriate venue. That caused some delay, as clearly the Sheriff Principal correctly wanted to make sure that all those that were represented would be able to be in attendance, and that required, as I say, to move out with what would normally have been the venue at the Sheriff Court. Clearly, this is a matter that the Government takes very seriously. We have met with Patricia Ferguson, and indeed the Solicitor General met with her. We've given a commitment to build upon and legislate on the good work carried out by Lord Cullen, and indeed, as part of that, we have been back to Lord Cullen to ask whether he wished us to update or upgrade matters in any way, and we've had a full response, which is simply to build upon the work that we're very grateful, and we will ensure that we do that, and I reiterate the commitment to legislate before the end of the lifetime of this Parliament.
Question 6, Maureen Watt.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what lessons Scottish agencies can learn from the extreme flooding in the south of England.
Minister Paul Beelhouse.
Firstly, can I take this opportunity to express the Scottish Government's sincere sympathy for the distress and trauma suffered by those affected by the floods in England. We have clearly been following the developments in the south of England closely. The main message we and all of our partner agencies have reinforced is that we need to remain vigilant and take every precaution possible in advance of severe weather events to make sure that Scotland is as prepared as it can be for any future flooding event. To that end, the Scottish Government has well-developed resilience arrangements which are activated in such circumstances, and officials raised with responders and partner agencies to assess the preparedness across Scotland for the potential impacts of forecast weather conditions. We are confident that Scotland is ready to respond quickly on all fronts to any changing conditions. Our own experiences around the festive period showed the importance of this preparedness. Having said this, we are not resting on our laurels, and as is normal practice, officials examine whether improvements can be made, and I chaired such a meeting in the aftermath of the events over the festive period.
Maureen Watt.
I thank the Minister for that answer. The Minister will be aware that parts of Scotland, although not so severely affected, have nonetheless suffered from the prolonged rain. Is the Minister really confident that the expertise and best practice within SEPA, the Scottish Government and Scottish local authorities is robust enough to act swiftly if Scotland is faced with a similar situation to that in England?
Minister.
In Scotland, we have fewer properties at risk from flooding, 125,000 compared to over 5 million in England, and SEPA have advised me that due to our geography, land use and demography, the impact of such heavy and prolonged rainfall would have been different in Scotland. Notwithstanding that, our strong multi-partnership working, Scotland's focus on advanced preparedness and our flood warning systems put us in good place to respond to challenging weather events, and I was certainly impressed by the response I saw over the festive period. I just want to put on record the Scottish Government regards flood protection as a high priority, and in the 8 years from 2007-08 to 2014-15, we will, in partnership with COSLA, who distribute the £42 million per annum we commit through the General Capital Grant to local authorities, have provided £326.4 million of capital funding for flood protection. This is some 7.4 times as much as was spent in the previous 8 years to 2006-07.
Question 7, Claire Baker.
To ask the Scottish Government when it last met Transport Scotland and what issues were discussed.
Minister Keith Brown.
Transport Scotland is part of the Scottish Government, and meetings with ministers occur regularly in the normal course of business. Indeed, I met with the Chief Executive and his team of directors this morning.
Claire Baker.
The Minister will be aware of the tragic fatalities that have occurred recently on the A92, which is within my region. During my time in this Parliament, I, along with other MSPs across the Chamber, have raised our concerns over the A92 many times, but the fatality rate has only increased. Can the Minister confirm that he will be meeting with concerned MSPs and campaigners, and does he agree with me that Transport Scotland must now prioritise a serious investigation into the safety of this road?
Minister.
I think the first thing to say is obviously our sympathies rest with those families affected by the tragedy to which the member refers. It's also true to say, though, I think that the level of expenditure on that road, A92, has been around £6.5 million over the last 3 years to improve it. We did look, as the member knows, some years ago at the issue of whether it should be dualled, and it was decided it wasn't the case that it qualified or merited dualling, and that was based on the STAG study that was done. I understand that the campaigners that she refers to would wish to have the STAG criteria changed, and I simply say we can't change the STAG criteria for individual projects, so we don't intend to do that. The member will also be interested to know that the number of injury accidents has actually decreased, notwithstanding the fatality to which she refers, from 73 in 2010, 52 in 2011, down to 41 in 2012. We will continue to look at the road and to improve it. I'm unable to make the meeting that was referred to, but I have ensured that Transport Scotland officials will go along to the meeting.
Question number 8, George Adam.
To ask the Scottish Government how it will reform welfare in an independent Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary Nicola Sturgeon.
Paper Scotland's Future sets out the principles that we would want to see underpin the welfare system of an independent Scotland. It also highlights some of the immediate steps an independent Scotland could take to reform welfare, like abolishing the bedroom tax and halting the rollout of universal credit. In taking on responsibility for our social protection system, we will of course be building on strong financial foundations, with spending on social protection currently more affordable in Scotland than in the UK as a whole.
George Adam.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer. In recent months, the amount of constituents coming into my office with regards to their benefit claims has increased dramatically. Specifically, people who are having job seekers allowance sanctioned. Can the Cabinet Secretary assure me that our welfare system would be a fair system aimed at assisting claimants instead of looking to sanction people in order to take forward Westminster dogma?
Well, I very much share George Adams' concern. Like many MSPs in the Chamber, I also have an increasing number of people coming to my surgeries and into my office with real concerns about the benefit system, and people who are in real hardship as a result of changes to the benefit system. And while any benefit system needs a sensible system of sanctions, there is no doubt that there are a number of people right now being subjected to sanctions who are seriously vulnerable and find themselves being sanctioned when often they don't know why that is the case. So I want to see a welfare system in an independent Scotland that is fair, that does everything possible to help people into work, but also provides a decent, civilised safety net for people when they need it. I think that's what most people in Scotland want to see.
Malcolm Chisholm.
Given that Scotland receives £200 million more in pensions and pensions credit than a standard UK distribution of payment by populations would allow, has the Scottish Government asked the UK Government if it can remain part of the UK pension system in the event of independence? And if the answer is no, will the Scottish Government say that it is bullying bluster that is not to be believed?
Cabinet Secretary.
Malcolm Chisholm, I think, sometimes beggars belief, because I know he is somebody who actually cares about these issues. I mean, we can trade statistics. I could point, for example, to housing benefit, which is proportionately lower in Scotland than it is in the rest of the UK, because we've got a higher proportion of social rented housing. Rents are not as high, and yet we are still being penalised by the bedroom tax. For example, I think it makes perfect sense for the Parliament that has control and responsibility over our health service also to have control and responsibility over how we deal with the most vulnerable people in society through our welfare system. And if Malcolm Chisholm wants to look at the detail of polls, and polls are a subject I'm quite keen on talking about today, as people will understand why, but if he looks at the detail of polls, he will see that a majority of people want control over pensions and welfare to lie in this Parliament, where they can be dealt with properly rather than left in the hands of a Tory government.
We now come to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.